Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the strange and unusual literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, a book that is about domestic terrorism, which is weird, although it is very normalized in the United States. As you'll see by what I'm talking about today, I am referring to The Injustice Never Leaves You by Monica Muñoz Martinez, and this book was published in 2018. So for those who don't know, Monica Muñoz Martinez is a sort of a journalist, a sort of educator sort of thing. Like, she's a writer, but she mostly writes nonfiction, and she's won a number of awards for her work. Her most famous work is, of course, what I'm talking about today. I don't think she's written, too much else, but this has sparked a lot of conversation and really sort of gotten people to consider the implications of the past and what it means for the present in terms of the Texas Rangers and border control and all kinds of stuff like that. So she's been writing for a little bit, and again, this is the only thing I could find out about her. So there's not too much information out there. She is Latina, so maybe she has a personal connection to what she's writing here. I know I would if I were Latino and I was writing about domestic terrorism towards Mexicans or people south of the border. So something to consider as we reflect on what I read for today. So without further ado, let's talk about The Injustice Never Leaves You. It's a pretty lengthy book, so I'll try to summarize most of it, and I'll do a little bit of an analysis, and we'll move on from there. So The Injustice Never Leaves You focuses on it focuses on a great span of time period, but the specific focus is the period between 1910 and 1930. Although again, it does encompass multiple eras of U.S. history. She starts by talking about Florence Garcia, a Mexican who was basically shot down by the Texas Rangers in cold blood. And although there was a little bit of an uproar about it, Martinez urges us to consider the larger view. She doesn't talk about the larger view, but a lot of what she does talk about and what she encourages makes me think of what Frank Norris wrote about in The Octopus, with needing to look at the larger view rather than the sensationalist, small things happening, even though they don't seem small. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But she also goes on to talk about the history of Mexico-Texas relations from the early, colonial period where settlers were coming in and building forts and missionaries and farms all around Texas, to the war between the United States and the Texas, which resulted in the United States getting a lot of land from Mexico. And at the same time, a lot of Mexicans, ethnic Mexicans, suddenly found themselves in America despite living in this general area for so long. And then became a period of basically imperialism where Texas and the government was coming in and saying, this land belongs to us now, forcing natives off their land, and also forcing the ethnic Mexicans who had lived there for a long time off their land, simply because they didn't have the deed, or they had a deed from a government that maybe didn't exist anymore. And so around this time, the federal government and the military comes in and starts, killing a bunch of people indiscriminately in the name of the common good of the U.S. And also around this time, you see the rise of the U.S. Rangers. And so Martinez asks, well, how does this turn out? Was this for good? And she notes that there were really two narratives from this period that rose. The first viewed the Texas Rangers as a force for good, defending the United States against savage Mexicans, a very racist kind of belief from someone who I don't care to name because they were terrible. The other narrative came much later, which examined the bandits and the the outlaws of the time, the Mexican outlaws, and viewed them as heroic in the face of Ranger sort of injustice, the injustice of the United States at the time. And while these are both interesting narratives, and I do think the latter has some truth to it, Martinez argues that we can't sensationalize history. We have to examine as it is and see the truth. And so we can find some truth by viewing these narratives and actually studying, other accounts that were passed down through generations and in the photos of the time. And so that's where the story really takes place. She then goes on to talk about Antonio Rodriguez, who was a Mexican living in the Brownsville region of Texas at the time. And she talks about Effie Henderson, how she was murdered by an unnamed Mexican. And a mob went out looking for that Mexican, and they picked up Antonio Rodriguez. Whether he committed the crime or not, they never really found out. Instead, they just decided to burn him at the stake and lynch him. And this became international news, with a lot of people saying, oh, they did the right thing in delivering justice, and other people asserting that they murdered someone in cold blood without actually delivering justice. And in the eyes of the court, because he did not have his day in court, Rodriguez is viewed as innocent. And despite all this being a hubbub, Martinez points out that other lynchings happened at this time as well, and they were mainly ignored because they weren't as sensational. And she also points to the present and notes that there's a lot of tension in the Brownsville region because for the ethnic Mexicans who live there, they see the people who are justifying the Rodriguez crime nearly a century later as denying their experience in life and also maybe kind of okay with them just dying and whatnot. So that's something that she talks about there, how the past also influences the present. She also goes on to talk about Bazan and Longoria, who turned to the Texas Rangers for help in solving sort of stolen cattle on their farm, and they were shot by the Texas Rangers because the Rangers viewed them as colluding with the bandits, the Mexican bandits who would come through Texas. Henry Ransom and other untrained Rangers were basically put on a trial, but they ended up getting off, and those who were sort of kicked out of the Ranger force, they eventually later re-enlisted. And it really goes to show that the government was never interested in holding these people accountable. They were only interested in making it look like they were so that no one could hold them accountable. A lot of this is told by descendants. It wasn't accurately reported by the Texas Rangers, who often lied. Rather, the descendants of Bazan and Longoria passed down their story as it actually happened. She also goes on to describe the Porvenir massacre by Rangers, where an entire town was basically killed. Most of the people in the town were killed by Rangers because the people in the town were viewed as, loyal to the deceptive Mexicans who were coming in and stealing things, and they weren't. They probably weren't. And it's part of a larger border dispute, and it really shows how these authorities were willing to lie and misrepresent the facts to get what they want accomplished, which is in this case, killing Mexicans. The governor tried to intervene, and again, you end up with a lot of re-enlistments later on, and not a lot of people being held accountable. Eventually, this gets so bad that President Wilson intervenes and condemns what's happening in Texas. But he only condemns it. He doesn't actually enforce any new laws, anti-lynching legislation, or actually try to solve the problem. It seems that Wilson wasn't really good at solving these problems. And so instead, the NAACP looks into the lynchings because the same thing was happening to Black Americans at the time, and that you really see the parallels in that story. You also see because of these people looking into the lynchings, you see people like J.T. Canales and other representatives working in Austin, in the state government, holding hearings about the Texas Rangers, and they were able to point out the Texas Rangers were abusing their authority, and a lot of people were wrong, but they're never held accountable because the other representatives on the committee saw the Texas Rangers as ultimately just, protecting Texas against the nefarious Mexicans and whatnot. So there's a lot of justification and a refusal to hold anyone accountable. Again, And then she also goes on to talk about ignoring history versus remembering it and what that means and how we truly honor the dead here. And that's about where the story ends there. There's a whole bunch of other things. So I do encourage you to kind of read this, although I'll talk about, some things earlier that might discourage you. But do go on and read this if you are interested. In terms of analysis, Martinez does give us a lot to think about when reading this story. One thing that I noticed that I had mentioned earlier was the idea of the larger view. So much like with The Octopus by Frank Norris, Martinez encourages us to consider, the wider picture. Because in The Octopus, there was this dispute between the railroad and farmers. But it's wrong to just look at that specific story. You got to zoom out and see the class struggle that's going on, see the power of the railroads growing out of hand. And in this story, if you view the sensationalist lynching, you lose the details, you lose what's happening. In the case of Antonio Rodriguez, a lot of people just forgot about F.E. Henderson entirely and just focused on the lynching. They didn't even report what Antonio Rodriguez may or may not have done. It was just about one side versus the other eventually. And so you have to stop focusing on individuals. The individuals are still important. Their lives matter. But you have to look at the trend, the growing domestic terrorism that was taking place, the abuse of power by the governor, the abuse of power by the Texas Rangers, the authoritarian violence that was taking place, the abuse of police power, the state sanctioning murders, essentially. You have to look at the growing trouble at the border and how that's reflective of what's happening today. So it's important to look at those trends and understand, what's happening then, because that'll help us understand what's happening now. If you look at individuals, you can't see the patterns and you can't see history eventually repeating itself. Again, this is getting back to the sensationalizing. If you sensationalize what happened to Antonio Rodriguez, you miss looking at the real aspect of the story, the real details and how a miscarriage of justice was carried out. And then eventually, when you sensationalize it, nobody actually tries to find justice, because it becomes more of a story than it becomes something that you have to actually examine even further. So it's all about getting lost in the details, which I'm guilty of sometimes. A lot of the times when a black individual dies at the hands of the police in modern times, one of the problems I notice is that we have a tendency to focus on that individual and make memes out of them, like Breonna Taylor, and say oh, we got to do something about Breonna Taylor. Well, that's true, but we also have to do something about police violence towards Black Americans and minorities in the state of in every state in the United States. So don't get bogged down in the details. I like how Martinez brings that up, because it's so easy to do it, and we have to focus on the historical trends and how it's affecting the present moment. Another thing that Martinez brings up is how this violence happens, and what she often asserts here is that the state often sanctions this violence. So in the case of domestic terrorism at the border in the 1800s and early 1900s, you saw it was being enacted by police officers in these local towns, by the military even, where the military comes in and starts shooting people at the border and trying to take people down, which often did not work hilariously. But it also happened through the Texas Rangers. And so you have to wonder, are bad Texas Rangers anomalies in this situation? Because you hear that a lot, it's just one bad apple. You don't need to defund the entire police force because of one bad apple. But were the bad Texas Rangers anomalies in this case? Were they potentially good? And the answer, I think, what Martinez argues is no. It's because of the lack of accountability and the freedom for the Texas Rangers to shoot and kill and steal and hurt anyone they came across that it made it so that the Texas Rangers were state-sanctioned murderers on behalf of the Texas government and the United States government in order to spread imperialism and make a path for the American way, and also to basically defend and establish capitalism in the Old West, because you had these native Mexicans living in the Texas area with plenty of arable farmland, but they weren't going to give it to the capitalists. So the military had to come in. The Texas Rangers had to come in and take this by force. And that's really how the West is won. You win it by force. You don't win it by diplomacy, unfortunately. And I'm not condoning that. I'm just acknowledging the truth in that statement. So how else does the state condone this? Well, they have it by a lack of accountability, because you had Texas Rangers basically investigating other Texas Rangers. You see that in modern day police forces too, with internal affairs investigating police officers. But the internal affairs are just other police officers, and they're not going to turn their buddies in or say that what they did was wrong. And so if they believe in the cause, they're even going to justify their actions by saying, oh, it was necessary to kill that person because they were bad or something like that. What you end up with is go nowhere hearings, go nowhere committees that attempt to investigate the Texas Rangers, but don't actually want to reveal the crimes or address the systemic inequalities or the abuses of power that take place. Because in order to do that, you have to completely uproot the system, and nobody wants to do that because they're making money off that system. They're benefiting from oppressing Mexican nationals or ethnic Mexicans in the Texas area. And I really like how Martinez gets at that, because so many people, I think, are afraid to say that the state condones this violence, that the state co-opts it and allows it to happen. And if you don't admit that, what you're basically saying is like you think that in some way the police can be reformed. But if we don't acknowledge that we have to acknowledge that the state condones the violence, because then we can reform the police. Because otherwise it's just one bad apple. It's a bunch of individuals. When in reality, it's an entire system that's just bad. It's rotten to the core, and we need to either completely revamp it or just toss it out and establish a new one. And so you might be wondering, Mr. Nothing, why does all of this matter now? And Martinez pretty much addresses that pretty efficiently in this story, because in the present moment, we're dealing with a lot of police violence, particularly towards Black Americans. But we saw in the protest from 2020 that the police were engaged in pretty huge corruption. They were willing to lie, they were willing to hurt, and they were not happy with being, held accountable at all. Like they threw a bunch of fits when it's like, oh, you're going to take our money away, or oh, you're not worshiping us as gods anymore. And I think that's what happened with the Texas Rangers. Like if we view what happened with the Texas Rangers, how they got so big and they were essentially investigating themselves, like we can see what's happening with the police now and how it's dangerous when no one holds them accountable, and when people try to justify all the murders and all the violence they do towards minorities. And the Texas Rangers are really a cautionary tale, because no one ever held them accountable. Like no one ever stopped them from doing what they're doing. And they didn't just end. Like the Texas Rangers might not be, what they are today, like the Texas Rangers, but the Texas Rangers did eventually evolve into border control. And so like if we don't do something about the police, they might evolve into something even worse. And that brings me up to my next point, the border. Because understanding that the history of Texas-Mexico relations has been violence, allows us to see like what's happening at the border in a new light, in a fresh light, because you see people being basically held in detention camps, especially children. And you see, people saying, oh, we got to send the National Guard to the border to protect it. Protect it from what? A bunch of children? A bunch of people who are hoping for a better life? And it's like, when you consider that that Texas-Mexico relationships and like our view of ethnic Mexicans has always been, these people are coming to steal your jobs, these people are coming to ruin your way of life, so we have to kill them or bring violence towards them in order to protect America. Like it's understandable. It's not good, but it's understandable what is happening at the border and why we need to change this, because if it continues, more people are going to die, and we're going to get essentially, a massacre of Mexicans in a way that was similar to what was happening in the 1910s. There's that photo that was passed around recently of the Border Patrol essentially roping and whipping Haitian Americans and immigrants at the border. And that's especially like, as I was reading this, I was like, wow, this is prescient to what I'm reading right now, because it's like we haven't changed in over 100 years since we first started calling out the Texas Rangers. Like, if anything, we've allowed their abuses to grow wider. And so another thing we have to consider is if this is what we are seeing, what aren't we seeing at the border? Because a lot of militia groups go to the border and, try to defend it. So what exactly are they doing at the border? Like, are they murdering people that we don't see? Like, what is going on? And, how do we stop that from happening? And I do think that Martinez does get at how do we stop this from happening in a pretty efficient way. One is just by simply calling out this injustice when we see it. Like when you get like JT Canales and other people holding committees to talk about the Texas Ranger, that's good. That's a start. But you can't simply allow the governor or the people in power to say, oh, this is right, this is just, we don't need to do anything about it. You need to actively fight that as much as possible so you don't condone murder or terrorism towards vulnerable populations. And what's more is you need to remember it and not simply commemorate the genocide, as is the case some of the time with people sort of holding the Texas Rangers up as a great force. We need to be truthful of what happened. And in a lot of cases, we can't do that because the Texas Rangers are viewed as so positively in Texas, despite the fact of everything that they did. And so we need to bring light to all the atrocities and not simply, like in the case of Robert E. Lee and whatnot, not simply celebrate without understanding and synthesizing that history. And that takes a lot of work. And then another thing that I'll always say is reparations, of course. Just give money to the people who suffered. That's hard to do, but it's right, especially when you enact domestic terrorism against people. The only solution is reparations. Pay people so that they don't feel like they were completely forgotten by the United States, although that definitely happened, and maybe there's nothing we can do to stop people from feeling that way. I will say the one thing I don't like about The Injustice Never Leaves You is it's very boring, like dreadfully boring. It just goes on and on and on, and at a certain point I'm like, I get it, Martinez, like I get what you're trying to say. Like, you didn't need to write this much. It's like 400 pages, and she could have gotten away with half that. And like she presented her case, but unfortunately she just didn't know when to stop. And a lot of the times this reads like I'm reading someone's thesis or doctoral dissertation on the topic of injustices towards Mexicans and the 1800s and 1900s. And like, that's fine, but like, you didn't need to publish this into a book. It's really slow at times, and it's really hard to recommend this to anyone because unless they're very into history, they're going to be bored in some way. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Injustice Never Leaves You, a wonderful, if somewhat boring book about domestic terrorism towards ethnic Mexicans in Texas during the 1800s and 1900s. I think it's an important read, very eye-opening read, and I will say that I did read it for my book club, so that was an excellent selection for this month, even though I was really bored. I think it's one of the more boring books that I've read for this book club, and it's like, it doesn't have to be, because I've read plenty of nonfiction before this, and it's always been exciting and good in some way, but this just has a different vibe, and so, it's hard to recommend, and, maybe you only need to read a couple chapters from the book if you do read it. If you have it at a library, go ahead and check it out. You probably don't want to actually buy this book like I did. Anyways, if you read this before, if you want to comment on something I said, feel free to do so below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this historical problem and also this current problem. And until then, I wish you the best of luck and your weird and social justice-y travels. Farewell.